And now we're going to have a little video from Adrienne Kennedy. She's the immediate past president of NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, appointed to serve in the newly created IPP position on the national board and on NAMI's executive committee. She also serves on the board of NAMI Central Texas. Prior to devoting herself as an active volunteer with NAMI locally and statewide, Adrienne was a research associate and doctoral candidate at the University of Texas at Austin College of Education. In addition to her board leadership, Adrienne is active as a national and state trainer for NAMI signature programs for families and for providers. On Saturday, NAMI Texas honored Adrienne with the 2020 Dedication to the Cause Award. Congratulations, Adrienne. It acknowledged 15 years of her volunteer commitment to NAMI in Central Texas across the state and nationally. When you get a chance, please congratulate Adrienne. And with that, let's hear from her.
Welcome. Thank you for joining me for this lived experience segment about our family's experience. I first want to offer personal thanks to Chief Justice Nathan Hecht, Presiding Judge Sharon Keller, the Judicial Commission co-chairs Justice Jane Bland and Judge Barbara Hervey, Jurist in Residence John Specia, and Christy Taylor, ED of the Judicial Commission, for the invitation and the opportunity of sharing my story, our family's story, my son's story, from my personal frame of reference. It's an honor for me, but especially an honor to the memory of our son, whom we lost 4 years ago, from the complex interactions of severe mental illness, bipolar 1 with severe psychosis, untreated in the last years of his life, and type 1 insulin-dependent diabetes, only discovered at his first crisis and treated erratically, becoming increasingly brittle, and difficult to treat as his mental illness progressed. The challenges that I faced in gathering my thoughts for today's sharing is one of attempting to identify salient points that are relevant or useful, either to highlight the complexities and the challenges that are experienced by individuals with severe mental illness and their family members, the chaos, the confusion, heartbreak, grief, and the guilt. Yes, the lingering, always present guilt that family members carry and that I reflect on to this very day about what I might have or should have done differently to support a better outcome, given our family's illness, his recovery, his incarceration, his continuing entrenched illnesses, often made more complicated and elusive by marijuana, and with his struggles to re-enter and sustain a meaningful life, considering the increasing severity of his illness and longstanding resolve to refuse treatment, itself driven by anosognosia, lack of insight, and growing paranoia. To begin, here are a few details about the chronology, the sudden onset simultaneously of both full-blown psychotic break and a diabetic ketoacidosis crisis. From sudden onset diabetes, unknown and undetected, as I said, before his psychotic break and his crisis hospitalization. No words can adequately convey the first shock waves that our family members and all family members experience when a loved one is overtaken by mental illness crisis and a psychotic break. Many of you have undoubtedly endured one or more catastrophic stressors in your lives, something that you had little or no previous experience for, no time to prepare, something that had significant unknowns and threats of terrible uncertainty, loss and danger for yourself or someone you loved. It's an almost paralyzing sense of dread, a moment that feels frozen in time, in which we know that it's impossible to go back, but it's also equally impossible to consider what lies ahead. And with the catastrophic stress of our son's first crisis, we were no exception. I had heard about mental breakdowns, and I knew the definition of psychosis, but nothing, absolutely nothing, in my background as an educator, an education researcher, or my husband's background as an engineer and physicist, prepared us at all for the journey that began that day and that plunged our son and us and our whole family into 17 years of our son's illness, his recovery, then repeating crisis, and the unrelenting attempts we all made, our son included, to understand the illnesses, manage the challenges, and deal with the crises and the totally unfamiliar landscape of severe and repeating crises, ultimately disabling mental illness. The level of severe mental illness that affects 1 in 25, not 1 in 5 or 1 in 4, but 1 in 25. Our son was one of the 1 in 25. In retrospect, our son's illness and our struggles could be characterized in distinct phases that I'm going to kind of run through a bit. The first 6 years, 1999 to 2005, included crisis hospitalizations, all voluntary hospitalizations on his part, periods of recovery, our son's willingness for treatment and ongoing medical care. The initial shock galvanized each of us, from our youngest son, who was 10 at the time, to the other three siblings, 16 through 21, to an 84-year-old grandmother, who all of us provided cohesive support and connection. As parents, we scrambled, my husband and I scrambled to learn and understand. At 23 years old, without any medical insurance, our son's medical bills became astronomical. After exhausting our savings, we remortgaged our house. Thank goodness we had the house that we could remortgage, because that became the only option. I resigned my PhD candidacy and my research position at UT to focus on our family and on our son and his wellness. Working to learn and manage insulin-dependent diabetes, no small feat all by itself, our son made one valiant discovery after another, one valiant recovery as well, with 4 major crisis hospitalizations in the rounds of disabling psychosis as they would overtake him suddenly. Each one demonstrating to him the value of treatment, of doubling his resolve, yet in many ways adding to his vulnerability. We understood that probably much, much more strongly than he did. The vulnerability for the next crisis, especially as he returned to his favorite spot in California, where he had moved and been working before his first crisis. After another restart round in California and a 4th hospitalization, our son resolved to stay in Austin, focus on his music, his filmmaking, interests, activities in local video productions, and staying connected with a small but solid foundational circle of friends, a wonderful new girlfriend who herself was keen on learning about how best to support and encourage our son's self-care and recovery. Then comes the next phase, 2 years, 2005 to 2007. These were filled with our son's rising recognition and his expectations, and the gap between getting back to a life that he envisioned for himself pushed against the realities of the work it takes to manage major illnesses. He watched bravely, but with this diminishing personal confidence and unspoken grieving that we could see as close friends and siblings finished degrees, launched impressive careers, and got married. Our son's initial experiences of recovery morphed at that point into a slippery slope of feeling, air quotes, well enough, and increasingly unwilling to continue treatment. Feigned bravado was now mixed with increasing internal pressure of a 30-year-old working to discount medical advice and assert himself into regular life, unwilling to settle for life circumscribed by 2 illnesses that he simply hoped would go away, or at least that he believed should be easier to manage. After his 5th emergency hospitalization in an unfamiliar facility, which in fact was without the usual positive engagement or patient-centered care, our son vowed to never seek hospital care again. The trauma of that particular hospitalization stood out in stark contrast to his previous experiences, and even as he continued to see his outpatient psychiatrist, we saw his levels of disdain and discouragement about all medicine, about all medical treatment, and a rising level of paranoia, increasing rants that he would go on about Western medicine and pharma, easily fueled by internet searches and the pro-marijuana sentiments, whether on the internet or among young adults. This shattering experience sent us, my husband and me particularly, into a whole new level of dread and discouragement ourselves, and we scrambled to understand the trajectory that we saw. Our son was increasingly really captured by paranoia and rising waves of hallucinations, accelerated by increasing access and use of marijuana, about which we were hopelessly naive and frankly in our own denial. These escalating realities ended with the loss of his girlfriend, which had had a huge impact on him, followed a year later by the death of his grandmother, who had also always been a close part of our 3-generation family. By 2007, our son railed against treatment and steeled himself with the support of others now who did not know how fragile or ill he really was, nor understood the dire consequences of his abandoning treatment. We watched, increasingly helpless, as our son sank into a level of crisis, psychosis, and paranoia. My husband and I explored every option, trust me, every one we could think of, and many options offered by other experienced voices. At this point, we consulted experts, other families with their lived experience, medical experts here and around the country, expert forensic psychologists even. This is the point at which we began to see that our son had been taken hostage. He wasn't just sick anymore. He was taken hostage by an illness. And none of the experts and none of our efforts to engage him in care or treatment were working. We were all entering into a very perilous stage. So here comes the perilous moments of 2007, 2008. Started off with his abandoning all treatment, moving in with a new girlfriend, declaring himself to be on a path of self-healing. His voices told him so, which included setting aside all diabetic care, including insulin. No more insulin. We were absolutely riveted with fear and dread, utter anguish over the unknowns, even of how long he could possibly survive without insulin. I did tons of research, no good answers. We kept contact with him and his new girlfriend, saw them weekly or oftener, visited him at his new job at a grocery store. This was the most intense and torturous time that any of us had experienced up to that point. All of us watched with great fear for his safety. He was so thin, he was actually unrecognizable one day when we went in to see him at his grocery store job. Together and individually, we explored every avenue of reconciliation toward medical care. His sister flew home from her job in Laurel, Maryland, to see him in person and connect with his girlfriend in hopes that we could alert her to the impending crisis. We used every way possible to stay connected, even as we watched him plummet into a level of physical distress and reassert time and again his absolute rejection of insulin and medical care of any sort, and his increasingly delusional claims of healing himself. By this time, he was physically covered with ringworm from the level of blood sugars that he was running. Finally, his reckless behavior resulted in his being picked up by police, taken to an emergency room, and hospitalized under an order of protective custody. Too medically fragile at this point to be placed in a psychiatric facility given his diabetic condition, he was kept for 2 weeks on the palliative care floor of Brackenridge Hospital until he was medically stabilized enough to be transferred to a psychiatric facility, which evolved into court-ordered treatment, 2 weeks inpatient of that treatment, followed by the remaining weeks as an outpatient treatment protocol. You can imagine our utter desperation and anguish that frankly continued unabated as his 90-day court-ordered treatment ended. He announced to all his medical points of contact that he was throwing out all his medication, including his insulin, and he would continue to heal himself. After this tumultuous period, he began 7 months of couch surfing and sleeping in his car. And with the help of a case manager that we had hired, he was able to get a one-room efficiency apartment. We thought this was a turning point and maybe a point of relief. We helped him set up a little kitchen, acquire the necessities, and while his hallucinations and disorientation were clearly evident to any one of us who knew him, he could manage to hold a conversation, go shopping, or eat out, sometimes almost as we would see him in waxy catatonia, lifting spoons slowly to his face. We were repeatedly called by his friends about his deterioration, and we were as frustrated as they were. We were all frustrated regarding what the next steps were going to be. 2 weeks later, he stole 2 checks from a friend, forged those checks, cashed them in a bank in person. Even in the middle of his psychosis, he could confabulate for 15 minutes at a time. He bought guns at a local gun store, picked up the guns after the 3-day waiting period, which clearly missed, flagging the fact that he had had a court-ordered hospitalization and treatment. Early on a Sunday morning in early September 2008, while exiting a local theater, he fired into the ceiling and 12 hours later into mounds of dirt in a park-like setting next to a busy Austin street. I'm convinced that he never recognized the level of wrongness. For him, he said, am I going to get my guns back? I paid for them. Yes, I'm going to pay the bank back, or I'm going to pay Doc back for that money. He really never understood. He said, of course, he wasn't going to hurt anybody. Well, you can imagine the immense gratitude that falls to my husband and me and all our family for the incredibly well-trained officers who arrived on the scene to apprehend our son, officers who had the skills, the training for what it would take to be safe themselves, and also to be able to apprehend someone holed up in the stall of a restaurant bathroom. He was trying to flush the guns down the toilet. That's how sick he was. We got a call at midnight from the last friend our son had seen, who had just been visited by other officers who were doing a wellness check after they had taken our son in custody and realized that he had been visiting a couple of people. By 1 a.m., my husband and I were at city jail handing a one-page detailed list of our son's medical needs, about his hospitalizations, and hoping that the medical summary would alert the jail nurse to the level of diabetic risk and history and the trajectory of severe mental illness our son was suffering. After that night, there were 8 more years, 13 months of county incarceration and adjudication on state charges, followed by 10 months of federal incarceration on the federal charge of lying and buying, which included 5 months at a federal medical prison in Kentucky for a very, very careful assessment of his mental state. Tragically, the naivete of a clinical psychologist in declaring no mental illness except by report, that report being a 3-inch thick binder of medical records and interviews with doctors and family members. It meant that when he was returned to Austin, the Western District federal judge felt he had no option but to release our son strictly on probation with some drug counseling, but no treatment required. On August 10th, 2010, with great hopes and our commitment to help him re-enter and readjust to life back in the community, we picked him up, took him to a small apartment that we were able to find, which itself is a miracle, considering how hard it is to find housing for a person with felony convictions. The first 22 months of his release and reentry were filled with our son's steady attempts to manage probation, take film and video classes, work at odd jobs, and work at his probation and reconnecting with the gifts of his guitar and keyboard. But given the stalwart position he held about managing his mental illness symptoms, which by now had become familiar and ever-present realities, and his access to street drugs, even the courageous adjustments that our son was making collapsed in another crisis. More chaos, extremely threatening behavior, and understandably, the revocation of his federal probation. After his last stint in a minimum security federal prison, our son did the best he could to navigate a life in the margins. He kept a small circle of friends who could not quite figure out the mysterious combination of his genius and his delusions. He occasionally interacted with his siblings by phone or text, but he withdrew almost totally from interacting with us, since in his universe, we were the ones who were connected with his years of treatment, all of which he felt was part of the conspiracy of the medical profession and pharma. There are mountains of shame, blame, and regret in our lived experience, but instead, as you can probably imagine, I really choose to commit myself to learning all I can, of researching all that is emerging in the medical field, treatment options, peer support, criminal justice reform, and integrated community care. Beginning in 2006 and continuing to this day, I actively pursue volunteer efforts with NAMI, frankly, as part of my healing, part of my family's healing, and as a commitment to our son. My resolve is for all of us to be part of forging better understanding and adding positive steps forward for individuals, for families, for providers, in the care systems and in the judicial system. I want to honor our son for what he endured in the last half of his life. It was a brilliant life, otherwise interrupted and fully derailed repeatedly by terrible illnesses. We learned of our son's death by police officers at our front gate on November 4th of 2016. From all they could tell and all the medical examiner came forward with, there was no foul play. It was not a homicide. There was no indication of suicide. So the best that any of us could come to, and the medical examiner as well, was that it was probably sudden bed death, which happens to 10% of those with type 1 diabetes who have brittle type 1 diabetes, and it happens between the ages of 20 and 40. Our son had just turned 41. So my commitment, you know what it is. You know that I share it with those of you I've met and worked with over the years. It's to do whatever is possible to turn hard facts and painful realities of serious illnesses and intellectual and developmental disabilities toward a strong support of medical efforts in research and treatment and data-driven awareness that we can bring to the systems of care and to the multiple layers of the sequential intercept model that has so much to offer as we deconstruct and build better, stronger systems. I firmly believe that together we are capable of creating change models that will make a difference. And that together, collectively, will be the best testimony possible for our shared commitments for a better future for all of us. Thank you for being with me. And please enjoy and pay close attention to the wonderful presentations coming up. Thank you.
Well, let us all thank Adrienne for that moving account of her family's experience. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, the Judicial Commission on Mental Health, and countless families have benefited from Adrienne's tireless advocacy.